The forest that regrows overnight. Imagine cutting down a forest, watching every trunk crash to the dirt, and waking up at dawn to find every single tree standing again, bearing the exact marks of your saw, warm to the touch, and softly pulsing with a heartbeat. Deep within the dense, mist-shrouded wilderness of the northern Cascades lies a stretch of land that doesn't appear on most modern maps. To the local logging companies in the late 1980s, it was known simply as Section 9, a densely packed patch of ancient, dark-barked firs that had remained untouched for over a century. In September of 1988, a commercial forestry crew led by veteran foreman Marcus Vance cut their way into the perimeter of Section 9. Vance was a practical man. He had spent 30 years in the Pacific Northwest timber industry, hardened by brutal weather, dangerous machinery, and the unforgiving silence of the deep woods. But nothing in his 3 decades of labor could have prepared him for what was waiting inside that canopy. On their very first day, the crew cleared a 3-acre swath of dense timber. Heavy diesel feller bunchers roared through the brush, felling dozens of massive trees. Trunks 4 feet thick crashed into the muddy forest floor, leaving behind jagged stumps, scattered sawdust, and an open sky where a dense ceiling of branches had stood just hours before. By sunset, the crew packed up their gear, locked the heavy machinery at the perimeter gate, and drove back to their base camp 8 miles down the mountain road. When Vance and his men returned at 5 o'clock the following morning, the morning fog was thick, so thick you could barely see 10 feet past the hood of the truck. But as the sun broke over the ridge and burned away the haze, the entire crew ground to a sudden halt. The clearing was gone. Standing before them was the exact same dense, impenetrable wall of timber they had spent 10 backbreaking hours flattening the day before. At first, Vance assumed they had taken a wrong turn on the unmapped logging roads. But there was their heavy machinery, parked precisely where they had left it, sitting in the shadow of trees that had not been there when they went to sleep. Confused and furious, Vance stepped out of the truck and walked up to the edge of the tree line. That was when the true impossibility of the situation settled in. These weren't young saplings that had somehow sprung up overnight. These were the exact same towering, old-growth firs. And as Vance reached out to touch the trunk of a massive tree directly in front of his machine, his heart sank into his stomach. Etched deep into the trunk was the precise wedge cut his lead sawyer had made yesterday afternoon. The angled notch, the jagged tear near the heartwood, even the unique kerf mark left by a worn saw chain, it was all there. But the tree wasn't lying on the ground. It was standing upright, firmly rooted in the soil, fully intact. It hadn't just grown back. It had reassembled itself. Vance touched the wood. It was warm to the touch, vibrating with a subtle, sickening pulse, like a limb that had been severed and sewn back on while the nerve endings were still firing. Whispers spread through the crew. 2 men refused to step out of the truck, insisting the forest was cursed. But Vance was a stubborn pragmatist. He refused to believe in ghosts or forest spirits. He convinced himself it was an elaborate, impossible hoax staged by radical activists trying to drive them off the land. Determined to prove it, Vance picked up a can of bright neon-orange surveyor's paint. He walked to a distinctive, crooked pine at the center of the stand, sprayed a thick, double X across its trunk, and personally ran the saw through its base until the giant tree crashed to the earth. "Nobody leaves tonight," Vance told his crew. "We stay in the trucks. We keep the spotlights on. And we watch." As night fell over Section 9, an eerie, unnatural silence blanketed the woods. No birds called. No wind rustled the leaves. The only sound was the idling diesel engines of 3 pickup trucks parked 50 yards from the felled pine. At 2:14 a.m., the temperature inside the truck cabs dropped rapidly. Frost began to spiderweb across the windshields from the outside. Then, the spotlights began to flicker. Through the dim, yellow beams, Vance watched in utter horror as the massive, felled trunk on the ground began to twitch. A wet, tearing sound echoed through the valley, the sound of wood fiber, bark, and dirt grinding against each other in reverse. The severed trunk didn't just lift, it was being pulled backward toward its stump, twisting through the air like a broken bone setting itself in the dark. And then, Vance noticed something moving inside the wood. A pale, gelatinous thread, glowing with a faint phosphorescence, pulsed within the raw heart of the splintered timber. It flexed like an optic nerve, binding the severed trunk back to its rooted base with a wet, nauseating snap. Bark rolled over bark, sealing the wound until only a pale, puckered scar remained, fading into the moss within seconds. Vance backed away, his heavy boot catching on an exposed root that hadn't been there 3 paces prior. The canopy above was closing in, the newly sprouted crown of the restored fir intertwining its needles with its neighbors, choking out the weak moonlight. The silence of the woods had mutated. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a dense, suffocating pressure, like the static hum of a live wire dipped in oil. He unholstered his sidearm, the cold steel of the grip offering zero comfort against a forest that treated trauma like a minor inconvenience. He brought his torch up, the beam sweeping across the clearing. Everywhere he looked, the fresh stumps from yesterday's logging crew were bulging. Pale, translucent sacs swelled from the sapwood, trembling under the strain of rapid cellular growth. Inside those sacs, dark, spidery shadows shifted, pushing against the membrane until it burst, unleashing thick, black vines that coiled around each other, thickening into solid wood before his eyes. "Harlan!" Vance called out, his voice swallowed instantly by the mossy floor. "Harlan, get back to the rig." No answer came from the northern ridgeline, only the rhythmic, churning sound of 100 subterranean pumps. The earth beneath Vance's boots vibrated, sending tiny tremors through his shins. He looked down and saw the leaf litter writhing. Pale, thread-like mycelium was weaving through the soil in visible waves, knitting together broken twigs, turning dry pine needles into a milky, digestive slurry that sank back into the hungry dirt. A sharp, metallic crunch echoed from the drop-off where they had parked the heavy machinery. Vance broke into a run, the underbrush clawing at his trousers, the branches snapping back into place almost the instant he pushed through them, closing the path behind him like water behind a hull. When he reached the ridge, he stopped, the air leaping from his lungs. The 6-ton skidded tractor, left parked in the clearing with a cracked axle, was no longer sitting on the dirt. It was suspended 6 feet in the air, caught in the crotch of 3 massive, pale oak saplings that had driven themselves upward directly through the engine block. The iron frame groaned as the expanding trunks sheared through the cast iron casing, spilling dark oil like blood across the white bark. Inside the crushed cab, a pale light flickered. Vance scrambled up the slick slope, his fingers digging into soil that felt warm, almost feverish. He reached the driver's side door, jammed half open by an emerging birch branch, and shone his light inside. The steering wheel was gone, wrapped in a thick tangle of glowing fungal threads that snaked down into the floorboards. Sitting in the operator's seat was Harlan's radio, its red battery light pulsing weakly. But Harlan wasn't there. Only his heavy yellow work gloves remained, still resting on the ruined console, filled to bursting with dense, tightly packed pine needles that were visibly lengthening, bursting through the stitched leather seams. A sudden drop in air pressure made Vance's ears pop. The temperature in the clearing plunged, his breath blooming into thick white clouds. From the center of the engine block, where the metal had been split wide open, a thick, knotty stem began to rise, crowned with a bud the size of a man's head. It peeled open with a wet slither, revealing not petals, but a tightly coiled mass of pale, optic fibers that slowly turned toward him, focusing like a wide-angle lens. Vance stepped back, his heel catching on the edge of the ridge, and fell backward into the suffocating, dark brush, listening as the forest began to breathe in unison. The impact with the damp earth knocked the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping in the dark while the canopy above rustled with a sound like millions of dry leaves being dragged across glass. Vance scrambled backward on his hands and knees, the thorny underbrush tearing through his heavy canvas jacket, but the pain felt distant, muffled by the sheer, overwhelming cadence of the woods. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, rhythmic inhalation, the soil beneath his palms sinking half an inch with every intake, then rising as the air was released in a lukewarm, sulphurous sigh that smelled faintly of copper and freshly turned grave dirt. He forced himself to his feet, thrashing through the choking foliage as he aimed his flashlight back toward the edge of the ridge. The beam flickered, the battery housing growing uncomfortably hot against his palm. When the light stabilized, the towering trunk of the grand fir he had used as a landmark 30 seconds ago was gone. In its place stood a towering, pale lattice of what looked like interwoven bone and bleached root, growing upward in visible, nauseating jerks. Every time the forest exhaled, the lattice surged 3 feet higher, unfurling broad, vein-streaked fronds that bled a clear, viscous sap where they scraped against one another. He pulled his compass from his breast pocket. The needle was spinning in frantic, mechanical circles, humming so hard the brass casing vibrated against his fingernails. "Think, Vance, think," he muttered, his voice swallowed instantly by the heavy, acoustic dampening air. He had mapped this sector 3 times last month. Sector 4 was supposed to be a flat, dead zone logging tract, cleared down to the bedrock by the lumber crews back in November. Yet here he was, trapped in a dense, towering abyssal maze that seemed to be actively altering its geometry around his intrusion. A sharp, metallic snapping sound echoed from the dark to his left. Vance froze, sweeping his light across the thicket. 10 yards away, a thick sapling, or what looked like one, was violently unspooling itself. It didn't grow from the soil, it pulled itself out of a deep, perfectly circular hole in the ground, its bark flaking off in gray scales to reveal a slippery, muscular tendon beneath. As he watched, the shaft bent at a sharp, unnatural angle, snapping like an elbow before locking into place. From its upper nodes, more of the pale, glass-like optic fibers emerged, glistening under his flashlight beam as they swiveled toward his face in terrifying unison. They weren't plants. They were sensory organs, anchor points, digits of something immense stretching itself under the earth. Vance turned and ran in the opposite direction, abandoning the phantom trail entirely. The forest floor was alive beneath his boots, a spongy, squelching mattress of fibrous moss that seemed to actively grip his soles, delaying each stride just enough to make his heart hammer against his ribs. Above him, the canopy had knitted itself completely shut, blotched with glowing, bioluminescent patches of bruised purple and sickly yellow that cast long, distorted shadows across the shifting terrain. He skidded to a halt at the edge of a deep ravine that hadn't existed when he crossed this ridge at dusk. Down in the pit, the darkness seemed almost solid, but it was the sound coming from the bottom that made the blood run cold in his veins, the distinct, rhythmic clinking of metal tools, followed by a wet, gurgling voice trying to whistle a tune he recognized. It was the melody Miller used to whistle when they were loading the haul trucks at the camp. Vance crept to the muddy lip of the drop-off, lowering his flashlight beam into the pit. 30 feet down, half buried in a writhing mass of fibrous, translucent roots, lay the yellow cab of Miller's logging skidded truck. But it wasn't crushed. The metal frame had been gently peeled open like a tin can, and sitting in the driver's seat was a shape draped in the same thick, pale fibers Vance had seen on the ridge. Miller? Vance gasped, the word slipping out before he could stop it. The shape in the cab stiffened. Slowly, with an agonizingly dry crunch of snapping cartilage, the driver's torso rotated a full 180 degrees to face up toward the ridge. The head tilted back, and Vance saw that Miller's face had been entirely replaced by a blooming, radial cluster of pale, twitching lenses, all focusing intensely on his beam. Then, Miller's jaw, still human, still bearing a patch of graying stubble, hinged open far past its natural limit, and the voice that came out was not one man's, but a choir of dozens overlapping in flat, emotionless unison. "You're late for the shift, Vance. You stepped past the threshold of the modern tree-lean, your boots sinking into deep, impossibly damp moss that hadn't been there when the sun went down. The air inside the overnight woods didn't taste like resin or pine, it tasted like rusted iron and cold groundwater, thick enough to cling to the back of your throat. Up close, the trees weren't right. The trunks were smooth and skin-warm, twisting upward at unnerving angles, their bark striated with fine, pulsing pale veins that shuddered whenever you took a step. High above, the canopy was so dense it swallowed the moonlight whole, leaving only a sickly, bioluminescent emerald glow bleeding from the underside of the leaves. Every sound from the town behind you, the hum of the highway, the distant bark of a dog, the wind against vinyl siding, was instantly snuffed out. The silence here wasn't empty, it was heavy, expectant, like the air inside a vault just before the door seals shut. As you pushed deeper into the sudden thicket, you noticed the ground beneath your feet giving off a soft, wet crunch. Looking down, you saw that the forest floor wasn't composed of old soil and decay, but a densely woven mattress of pale white rootlets, thousands of them, writhing in slow motion to anchor the newborn giants. Then came the rustling. It wasn't the darting motion of a fox or the heavy tread of a deer, but a rhythmic, sweeping dragging sound that seemed to move in a massive circle around you. You raised your flashlight, its beam cutting a pale wedge through the hanging tendrils of white lichen. The light landed on a massive oak, or what looked like an oak, its trunk split wide open like a hollow ribcage. Inside the cavity, submerged in a pool of clear, viscous sap, sat something metallic. You leaned closer, the beam illuminating a rusted yellow bicycle frame, its front wheel bent into a jagged figure eight. Hanging from the handlebars was a small, faded plastic lunchbox with a name scrawled across the side in permanent marker, Benny, 1984. Benny had vanished from the edge of town 40 years ago during a summer heatwave, his disappearance blamed on a wandering stranger. But the tree hadn't swallowed the bicycle over decades of slow growth, the trunk had grown around it in a single night, sealing the artifact into its wooden heart as if preserving a display in a museum. A sudden, sharp snap echoed 10 yards to your left, followed by the wet sound of tearing timber. You spun around, the flashlight beam trembling in your grip. Another spire of dark wood was breaking through the moss, rising like a slow-motion spear into the dark. As it expanded, the bark peeled back, revealing a dense cluster of human-shaped knots and whorls. The forest wasn't just expanding outward, it was constructing something. It was building a memory of everything that had ever been lost in these woods, stitching missing pieces of the past into its rapid, unnatural expansion. The dragging sound was closer now, directly behind you. You turned slowly, the cold iron air filling your lungs, expecting a beast, a phantom, or some twisted denizen of the deep dark. Instead, you saw a sapling no taller than a man, its pale leaves quivering in total windlessness. Hanging from its topmost branch, swaying gently back and forth, was your own leather keychain, the one you had dropped on your porch steps just 3 hours ago. The woods hadn't just grown over the abandoned valley overnight. It had reached the edge of your driveway while you slept, quietly swallowing the boundary line between the wild and the places where you feel safe. As the canopy closed overhead completely, blotting out the last faint glimmer of the stars, a cold realization settled into your bones. If the forest can devour 40 years of history in 8 hours of darkness, what happens when it realizes it no longer needs the night to grow? Complete.